Coming up next on the Cultural Connections podcast, we'll be joined by Bob Kelly, Executive Director of NewTV in Newton, Massachusetts. This episode is being recorded live on Wednesday, May 5th, 2021. This is the Cultural Connections podcast.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Ives, and I am the producer and host of the Cultural Connections podcast. Before I introduce our guests this evening, I want to remind all of our viewers that we are coming on here live on Wednesday, May 5th, Cinco de Mayo, 2021. And we are recording this live on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So in other words, if you have questions you would like answered during the broadcast today, please feel free to comment below on the platform you're watching. For the first part of the show, we will be monitoring our Facebook feed. The second part will be the Twitter feed, and the last part of the show will be the YouTube feed. So for about a 30 to 40 minute broadcast, roughly about. Without further ado, let me introduce our guest today. Our guest today is Bob Kelly, Executive Director over at NewTV in Newton, Massachusetts. We're going to be discussing community media today, specifically looking in depth into specifically issues of what community media is, what's currently happening with community media, what the impact the COVID-19 pandemic had on community media, and the future of community media. So thank you, Bob, so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Brian. I appreciate it.
I'm glad you're here. So without further ado, let's start off with you telling our viewers a little bit about yourself before we get into a little bit about a background on community media.
Sure. So many moons ago, I was in the music business and worked for Don Law Productions here in the Boston area, and Tim Collins, former manager of Aerosmith. So I traveled around a little bit when my hair was your color. So I had an audio background, and then got into cable television in 1990 and ran local channels in Waltham, Massachusetts, and then came over here in Newton in 2008 and took over for a long time Executive Director Paul Berg. So I've been around cable television for 31 years now, and so I know a little bit about it. Not everything, but a little bit.
A good amount, that's for sure. All right. Well, let's for our viewers that are watching this that don't really know, let's start off with really, in a nutshell, what is community media for our viewers that really don't know what it is?
Okay, so way back in the late 70s, early 80s, cable television was born to try to bring signals to homes that were, on the other side of a mountain and couldn't get the satellite or antenna signals that were servicing homes on the other side of the mountain. So a cable was brought over, I think it was in Pennsylvania, over the mountain in order to provide that. And that's kind of where cable television was born. In 1984, the Cable Act was created on a federal level in Congress and the FCC. And that said pretty much that cable operators, which we now know are Comcast or Verizon or RCN here in Massachusetts, Charter, AT&T and the like, that they would provide 5% of their gross revenues for community television stations. Now, here in Massachusetts, I would say 90 to 95% of the 220 community media centers in Massachusetts are nonprofit organizations. So we would get 5% of everybody's cable bill to fund the operation. And what does that mean? Well, it started with just P for public. And that was people like yourself, Brian, who would come in and learn how to use the equipment and then be able to express themselves, their First Amendment right. So rather than standing up on top of a milk crate in the middle of a common, yelling, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore," you could go into the local community television station, learn how to use the equipment, and sit in a studio or take the camera home and then express yourself. And it wasn't just about people sitting in the studio. It was also providing an opportunity for people to do videos, documentaries, and what have you about whatever topics they wanted. So that's how it started. Then the E and G was added, the educational and government channels, coverage of local meetings, city council, school committee, town meetings, board of selectmen meetings, high school sports, graduations, zoning and planning meetings. And so it's kind of grown more towards the G side over the years than the P or E. So PEG, public educational government channels, are on cable television. So what does that mean? So 5% eventually, was coming out of the cable operators' gross revenues. Then they were able, right around, I think, 2001, pass that on to the consumer. So now you were actually paying for community television out of your bill. There was an additional line item added to your bill. And then there was capital dollars that were provided by the cable operator too, and they were subsequently able to pass that along too. So that was a capital equipment budget that we were accustomed to. So as PEG television were, kind of evolved over the years, you saw municipalities wanting to see more on the G side and less on the P and E side. So, but we've been able to preserve all three here in Newton. But some communities have kind of transformed into pretty much government channels. The issue on cable television, though, is that when HD television came into play, we were on standard definition. So channel 4 was the local broadcast channel, channel 5, channel 7. So we had CBS, ABC, NBC. And then on channel 8 was the local channel. So that was great when there was 60 cable channels, but when there was 600 to 1,000 cable channels,
Right.
and HD television was created, they never moved us up with the HD tier. So we stayed mired down. Still today, most of us are still sitting down in channel 08 where nobody watches because everybody's got a 75-inch TV with smart TV, and they're watching all the HD channels and not SD channels. So we've lost viewership, we've lost relevancy. So we had to adapt and be able to provide content online as well. And that's where we are today, is we're really a content distributor of local programming. And how we get that out is, through cable, but also through, broadband, through the internet and Vimeo, YouTube, what have you. So that's kind of where we are today. We're called community media instead of public access.
Right.
So public access is kind of like Voldemort. We don't use that term anymore. It doesn't come off our lips. So we're called community media, and I think that's a better term for who we are than public access.
Of course. Well, moving forward here, and before actually we go further with the next question, I do want to remind our viewers here that are just tuning in with us that you're watching live. If you're tuning in on our live broadcast, we're recording this episode on Wednesday, May 5th, 2021, on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Right now, we are currently monitoring our Facebook feed. So if you have questions and you'd like them answered about community media, anything related to community media, you can comment below on Facebook right now, and around 10 minutes from now, we'll switch over to our Twitter feed and then monitor over to the YouTube feed to end with the last part of the broadcast. But with my next question here, kind of bringing things into a perspective today, and obviously everyone that this past year has been a crazy year with the COVID-19 pandemic. What sort of impact has the COVID-19 pandemic had on community media centers? And continue to, since we're still not really out of this pandemic yet.
So I think a lot of us, wish we had Zoom stock prior to the pandemic starting. We're utilizing Zoom quite a bit. There's a lot of government meetings now that, everything's virtual. So we're covering more meetings than we did before because we couldn't get in those committee rooms where those meetings are. Now everything's done through Zoom. We're just capturing through Zoom, the meetings and sharing that to our viewers. So that's I guess maybe the transparency in government thing is being supported here through Zoom by us being the vehicle to provide those meetings to viewers at home. Again, that's online and on cable. So that's the first thing. We were able to, purchase different equipment, ring lights, and cameras and tripods for people to take home, like yourself, and be able to sit there in the confines of your home, safe, and be able to put, packages together, programs or shows together for, your viewers, and then send it back to us. So equipment purchases were different. We're all working virtually. I didn't realize that I could work so well from at home. But we all worked it out, and so now what we're doing is a mix of coming into the office and working from home. And that, my family would prefer me to come into the office and not be at home, I think. I'm kidding, but I think that's the initial part, was that we were trying to figure out how to serve our members and our viewers properly during the pandemic, and I think we've been very effective in providing them with content still.
Absolutely. So the next question here, and you alluded to this sort of at the beginning, a little bit earlier on, is about funding for community media centers, and one of their big ways of getting their funding, which I think you mentioned a little bit to you, is about franchise fees, which I think a lot of people tend not to know what franchise fees really are, and they see it on their cable bill, I think, a lot of the time, and they glance over, but they never really understand what a franchise fee is. For the purpose for our viewers, can you explain, because obviously it's a source of funding for community media centers, can you explain a little bit more in depth on what franchise fees and how they help community media centers?
Yeah, so going back to the Cable Act of 1984 and the Telecom Act of 1996, and I think there was another rewrite after that of the Telecom Act at some point in 2000 maybe, but there were 5% of everybody's cable bill was available for public educational and government channel support. Whether or not we got all 5%, depending on the community that your community media center is in, remain to be seen, right? So here in Newton, we actually get 4 of the 5%, and 1% is kept by the city of Newton for their uses. But that franchise fee is for the support of local channels, and also a piece of it goes to the FCC, and maybe even in Massachusetts case, a portion of that would go to the DTC, the Department of Telecommunications and Cable, which is a division of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So those fees are all wrapped into that local franchise fee or license fee, right? So that's it. So those fees, much of that would come to us. It originally came directly from the profits of the cable company, because it's a rights of way thing, Brian. The cable companies back in 1984, when the Cable Act was written, the government said that if you're going to hang wires over the public roadways, you're going to pay a fee. And that fee was for public educational and government channel support. So those wires are still hanging there, whether it's cable television or broadband, remains to be seen. But we look at those wires that provided cable television for many years from the street to the house, still hanging there, but now it's internet. It's coded differently, right? So that's it. Those fees are to support local community media and your federal and FCC and DTC.
Okay, yeah, but let's transition that into the fact as we look ahead here, and what we're saying is, you mentioned that that's a big portion for community media centers to get that franchise fees, and that obviously comes from a cable bill. today what we're seeing is a lot of people, because we're in this day and age where cable bills are exorbitantly high to afford to have the cost of cable in one's home, either whether it be Comcast, Verizon, etc. And people are making the transition into a more of a less cost-effective option to switch to a streaming network, streaming platforms like Netflix, Hulu, all of these different streaming platforms that are becoming the new thing. Obviously, that must have some sort of impact on community media centers. What's being done about that? Because obviously, that I would assume that would hurt funding for community media centers.
Yeah, good transition, by the way. I like the segue. So we call those Netflix and Hulu and Disney Plus and Peacock and Kindle digital products. So as of August of 2020, there were 28 states that had a tax on digital products. So, and the analogy is if you went into Best Buy and you bought a DVD of a movie, you would purchase it and pay sales tax, right? Or even if you went to the movie theater, the ticket included sales tax. So those 28 states realized that Netflix was providing the same movie that you would buy at Best Buy or go to see at the cinema, and there was no sales tax. So now they've levied that sales tax against Netflix for the services or products that they're providing the consumer. Massachusetts is looking at that as well, and there's a bill H-130 that would levy a 5% tax on streaming providers such as Netflix, Hulu, and a portion of that would be available for community media, and a portion would go to municipalities, and then a portion would go to the state. So of the 5%, 2% might be geared, targeted for community media support, 2% for the municipalities that have the wires hanging over their roadways, and 1% for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, just to support their general budget, I guess. And don't forget, now Massachusetts also has a 5% surcharge on satellite providers too. So Dish TV they pay 5% of their gross revenues right to the Commonwealth, and none of that is shared with municipalities or community media because there's no wires hanging over the roadways and there's no local channels like NewTV. So all of that goes directly to the Commonwealth. So cable has a 5% surcharge. Streaming would have a 5% surcharge if the bill passed. And so we've lost probably 27% of our cable subscribers here in Newton over the last 5 years. And that's results in a lot of revenue loss for NewTV.
Right.
So would that 2% replace that? We're not sure. But the municipality could also elect to take their 2% and send it to the community media center. And we're hoping that happens here in Newton.
Great. And before again we go further, I just want to once again remind our viewers that if you're joining us on the live broadcast, we're live here on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Right now, presently at this time, we are monitoring our Twitter feed. So if you have questions you'd like answered during the broadcast today, head on over to Twitter. We'll be looking at YouTube in around 5 minutes or so from now. In the next few minutes, we'll switch over to YouTube. But for now, we're on Twitter, and we'll be monitoring YouTube towards the end of our broadcast. But let's move forward here now, and let's talk really more now that we've talked about present, let's look towards the future with community media centers. We're obviously seeing, as it seems like by day, things evolve with technology. We've seen we've seen the way how community media centers continue to change from going, as you mentioned earlier, from public access to community media. What's next for community media centers as we look ahead down the road?
So I think the inevitability is going to be regional providers. So as I said, there's 220 community media centers in Massachusetts, but as cord cutting continues, there's cord cutters, people that had cable and cut the cord, and then there's cord nevers, right? It's your generation that may have never had cable, they've never, lived off of it, never got their entertainment or informational programming through it. So So as cable kind of disappears, I think, if those streaming revenues don't replace the lost revenues in cable, you'll probably see some community media centers close in the smaller budget ones or smaller communities. And so you may end up seeing a regional provider. So let's say NewTV became a regional provider for the area. The studio and facilities would be available to more residents. You already see some of that happening in Massachusetts and outside of Massachusetts. Cape Cod Media Center, I think, services 6 to 8 communities. Plymouth does that for 4. So you already started to see that happen before, and I think that will probably be the likelihood in the future. And that's for public educational and government services. At NewTV, we've already added a subsidiary for full production work, right? We've done original programming, won 13 Emmys. We have pilots that are now available for distribution to other networks. Should another network want to purchase one of our pilots, they could do so. We do corporate video work for Fortune 500 companies now. So we have to broaden our menu of services to beyond just public educational and government services. Newton News has been active for many years, but will we be a regional provider of local news? That could happen as well. So I think broadening our features and level of services is key to our survival as cable cord cutting continues to happen at an alarming rate, actually.
Very interesting. So I guess, you were just alluding to, I was going to get into next here, is with the other services like a station like NewTV has to offer. How are more the bigger, I guess, community media centers that have is their intent to try to follow a similar model? Is that going to be for the bigger stations, going to be the new model for community media stations as time goes on, to try to add more to the station and more services offered, or stick with what it is now?
So it's for NewTV since really 2010, we've been heading in this direction with the adding the production house kind of level of services where we do corporate video work. We've become not just a community media center. We're kind of a community center with a media flair, right? So we have artwork hanging up in the hallways. We do artist galleries here, wine and cheese, and every 5 weeks the artwork gets changed out. We host events here. We have small musical performances by Livingston Taylor or others. We work on documentaries that are shown internationally. We contribute to that. So a lot of them, if they haven't already headed there, they're probably not going to be able to survive. Like I said, we've been doing it for 11 years, so I think we've found a niche and created Another Age Productions, which is the for-profit subsidiary. They really need to get going, if they haven't started already, by adding all those other services and non-cable revenues. And that was the game. The game was to replace cable revenues with non-cable revenues. Can't just wait for legislation to add streaming. You had to have been working on that already. And some of them are doing it. We're getting the calls. They want to be NewTV, but they're starting a little late. So we hope they make it, but some have been successful in making that transition earlier, but prior to the pandemic. But those that are trying to do it now, I hope they make it.
Right. Now, another big thing with a lot of community media centers is, as you also mentioned towards the beginning of the show, is the transit of having, because most people, when they think of community media centers, they think of the station, like you mentioned, on the local channel 8 or channel 9, at the standard level of a channel. I know like stations like NewTV have already progressed to the fact with some of the cable companies to get HD channels. Is that also something that at a national level, let's say, is being considered? What is the prospect looking for getting the community media centers to have HD channels out there so people actually see the content that's coming out of community media centers?
Yeah, that's been a battle for many years, Brian, is to try to get on an HD channel. So, what we face, for Verizon, they gave us an HD channel and they put it on channel 2134. Well, who's watching television on, the 2100 area? So that we call that channel slamming. It's one thing to give us an HD channel, but you slammed us into 2134. Nobody's watching. So you might as well still be mired down in the standard definition tier. If we're not going to be next to, channel 457, Fox TV, and the local sports network or GBH, public broadcasting, then nobody's really going to find us. And so it's really about us being a content provider and getting it out on not only cable, on whether it's SD or HD channels, but it's also you're getting it on YouTube and Vimeo and providing it, snippets on it of our programs and teasers on Twitter and Instagram and everywhere we can to promote it. So I think if you promote it on social media properly, they'll find us, whether, but like I said, I think we have to be a content distributor and not just be a cable channel like we were for many years.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think another thing too that's been seen with community media centers, especially a station like NewTV, which developed the fact, which I think for myself, I've seen it. I think I've heard others say the same, is having if not all of the content that you would regularly see on NewTV, you see it also now on the website on demand, available to watch at your leisure and your convenience. You don't have to go back in the day when you had to go online to the website, find when that program was going to air, and then get to your TV at that time to watch it. Now, I mean, there's the availability of watching it online. Is this something that other stations are looking into as well, to bring their content online to make it more accessible to communities and to broaden the reach of people being able to see content?
Yeah, I think as long as we're being paid, from cable subscribers, we have an obligation to provide free content to, the people in Newton, right? But those that don't have cable, that are watching the local city council and school committee meetings and, high school sports and staying in touch with their local community, they're not contributing to our revenues right now, our operating budget. So we have to find a way that they will contribute in the future. So
Right.
let's say that, we put up on YouTube and Vimeo the latest, 3 city council meeting or 3 sporting events or subcommittee meetings. So that content would be available for free for those internet subscribers or broadband users. And so, but after that, we're going to archive them, and maybe there's a $1.99 a month membership fee that they have to pay to watch the archive content, because we have to pay for that. We have to pay Vimeo or AWS for archiving all that data, that video data. So, and it gets expensive, and so that line item in our budget is growing because the demand is still there. So in order to support the expenses associated, the costs associated with archiving, we'll probably have to do something where there's a monthly membership fee or annual membership fee for those online viewers. But the latest 3 would be for free, and then the archive stuff would be fee based.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that makes common sense. Again, I just want to remind our viewers one last time today that if you're watching during our live or joining us during our live broadcast, we're live on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And right now, at the present time, we are monitoring the YouTube feed. So if you have questions you'd like to ask about community media, the future of community media, and you're on YouTube at this time, now is the time to do it within the last few minutes of the broadcast today. Thinking ahead and how we see a station, I mean, and I've been into many community media centers myself, and we see stations that have developed like New TV going from a small facility into a big facility. How for community media centers, I mean, is the goal, I guess, in mind to see more community media centers try to grow over these next, especially with this pandemic? I assume that this pandemic led to growth for community media centers much more significantly difficult than it would be if we did not have this pandemic get in the way. Would I be correct in thinking that with the COVID-19 pandemic getting in the way of growth for community media?
Yeah, it has been, obviously. I mean, there are a lot that have leases. So, we're in an office building, Brian, our location. So, we have an office condo that we own. We don't own it yet because the bank still owns it, but we're paying a mortgage payment, not a lease payment or rent payment. And a lot of community media centers around Massachusetts and around the country are actually paying leases to be in the space that they're in. So some of them have made a conscious decision to reduce the size of their footprint, to cut down on their expenses, and I get that. So I think the pandemic has put them in a position where they don't have these large studios any longer because nobody's coming in. So their studio and control room might look more like an office size rather than a large studio size. So I think that's happening, and that's, we owe that to the pandemic. But moving, back to a society where people are actually able to, come together again, and I think that day is coming. We have to be ready for what does that bring. We definitely see Zoom and virtual participation as something that'll stay for a while. So we have to accommodate that, and our equipment budgets are changing, Brian, because the normal, retrofit everything that we have in the studio and edit suites and our training center with 8 desktop computers and everything. We're doing webinars now, so maybe we don't need that training center. We're buying equipment that will facilitate hybrid meetings on Zoom or Teams or whatever product that we're going to use with the city in towns in the area. So we're putting equipment up that will facilitate those virtual or hybrid meetings of the future. So our capital budget, our approaches are different as a result of the pandemic, but we see a day where the facility will be thriving again, and a lot of people will be in here utilizing our services. So
Absolutely.
we hope.
Yes, one can only hope. I think we're getting there. Well, it's amazing to think that we have already reached the end of our fast 40-minute broadcast here. Again, want to thank Bob Kelly, Executive Director of NewTV, for joining me today. For our viewers that live in the Newton area that are watching this, if you are a Newton, Massachusetts resident and would like to learn more about NewTV and more about this amazing facility, then you can visit their website at www.newtv.org or give the station a call at 617-965-7200. Personally, from my over 15 years of experience involved with this station, I can say that that it is an impressive station. And if you are someone that's interested in video production and again lives in the Newton area, check out the facility. It's worth it. Once this pandemic is over and you can get back in there and do things like we did before this pandemic, you won't be disappointed. I can guarantee that. I also want to say that if you have questions or comments or would like to submit ideas for future episodes for the podcast, you can email me at brianives@gmail.com. That's BRIANIVES @gmail.com. Thank you again to Bob for joining me on this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast, and we'll see you for the next episode very soon. Thank you, everyone. That's good.
Joining us for this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast. To learn more about this episode, be sure to check out our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also listen to this podcast in its entirety on listening platforms Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Breaker, Radio Public, NewTV, and many more of your favorite podcasting platforms. Thank you again for joining us on this episode